Hello, I hope you're all well. Today we're looking at the second part of the exposure triangle, shutter speed! As mentioned in the previous video, your exposure is built up on three aspects: your ISO, your aperture, and your shutter speed. Today we're going to be focusing on the last of those three, shutter speed. Now what is shutter speed, I hear you ask? So shutter speed, as the name suggests, is how quickly or slowly your shutter is open for. This has two effects on your image, just like aperture does. One is that it will affect your exposure, so the longer your shutter is open for, the brighter the image is, the shorter, the darker the image is. And the second is motion blur and camera shake. So when adjusting your shutter speed, it's the same as using aperture or ISO, and the easiest way to do so is what's called a stop of light. So stop of light, just to recap, is either a doubling or a halving of the existing amount of light you've got. It's not a fixed unit like a meter, it varies. So say for example we've got a shutter speed of 1/50th of a second. If I double it, if I make it faster, we would go to 1/100th of a second, and if I half it, we'd go to 1/25th of a second. Either of those directions are a stop of light because it is double or half the amount of light that was already there. So that's the easiest way to adjust your shutter speed and compensate for that. So what is motion blur? Motion blur is as your subject is moving across your frame, how much or how little they streak across. So if you have a faster shutter speed, this will mean that your subject looks perfectly still, whereas if you have a slower shutter speed, your subject looks like it is moving in the frame. So first of all, let's talk about camera shake. Camera shake is the physical action of your camera moving when you press the shutter. Typically speaking, the easiest way to resolve camera shake is to have a shutter speed twice as fast as your focal length. So here I've got a 50mm lens. The easiest way to get camera shake on this will be to have a minimum of 1/100th of a second to get rid of that. Now of course this is assuming that you're shooting handheld. You can of course, if you're careful and if you improve your technique, you can get slower shutter speed to get sharp images. Camera shake is probably one of the biggest culprits of images that aren't sharp. Now of course, in more modern cameras like the Sony A7 Mark II that I'm filming on, this has what's called in-body stabilization. That means that the sensor moves around to compensate for the camera moving to give you a sharp image. You can also buy what's called a stabilized lens. Nikon, for example, call it VR or vibration reduction. This will do the same thing just in the camera lens. This will allow you to shoot at slower shutter speeds depending on what your focal length is. I, for example, have shot my Sony A7 Mark II on a 300mm lens at 1/20th of a second, which is the 4.5 stops below what I would need as advertised on the image stabilization for Sony. But moving on, the more important aspect of the shutter speed is the creative aspect. Now your shutter speed will vary a lot depending on what it is you want to shoot. Normally if you're shooting something fast like sports or wildlife or gigs, you want a faster shutter speed. Whereas if you're shooting something like landscapes, for example, you might want it a bit slower so that you can blend those clouds together or smooth out the water. Now to get a faster shutter speed, typically speaking, you will either need to have a higher ISO or will need to open your aperture, or potentially a combination of the two depending on how light or dark it is outside. For example, I shoot a lot of gigs. Gigs are typically shot in low light, and as a result sometimes I need to open my shutter up to get a brighter image if my aperture is all the way open. Typically I will shoot a gig at the widest open aperture that my lens will give, typically f1.8. Some musicians will jump around the stage and pogo around and really build up a sweat. Some will stay perfectly still. One gig I shot, a band called the Gary 7, a surf rock band / spy-fi, was their guitarist when they're playing typically stands quite still, so what I was able to do was take a shot of them and actually have the fingers darting around the fretboard, so the rest of the image was still but the fingers were moving around. This gave you an idea of how quickly they were playing. You could also do the polar opposite, so you could get someone who's say jumping around a lot, you could get a photo of them in mid-air. I don't think I have any of those, but it's a good thing to do. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you a few different shutter speeds. So a fast shutter speed, for example, 1/500th of a second. Very quick, so we'll do 1/10. And then we're just going to take it up to a second now, just so that you can really... So let's go for a case study. I'll use gig photography as an example. So when I go out and shoot a gig, I will tend to ride on the shutter speed. So what that means is I will anchor down my aperture and my ISO so that they're pretty much fixed. Typically I will shoot my ISO at 800. This allows me a great amount of flexibility while still giving me a good amount of quality in the image. 800 is normally the highest I like to shoot my A7 Mark II, especially where it's got things like the image stabilization that will allow me to shoot those slower shutter speeds. I will also normally shoot my lens at f1.8. This allows me a shallow depth of field, which I like in my images, but where I'm typically stood a bit further away, it's still normally deep enough to pretty much get the whole subject in focus, but this allows me to shoot a faster shutter speed as well. So then as a result, my shutter speed will normally vary from anywhere between a 50th of a second to anywhere up to 1/2000th, depending on what the lighting conditions dictate. The lights will change so much in a gig. You'll get strobes, you'll get flashes, you'll get fog machines that will diffuse the light. So as a result, having just one element of my exposure triangle to focus on and change gives me a great amount of flexibility, and it just means that I've got only one thing to really focus on to dial in my exposure and get it looking good. I'll also typically change the shutter speed depending on what my subject is doing, so if they're jumping around or if they're fast or slow moving, I can adjust for that accordingly. Oh, I've got home and told me to take the hat off because apparently I look silly. So I hope you found this video useful, and I hope you got a bit more of an understanding of shutter speed and how you can implement it. Next, talking technical, we're going to look at ISO. It's a riveting subject and I find it even more interesting than shutter speed, so don't be surprised if that's in a few videos time. I hope you have a lovely day.